They sold all Arapaho girls at auction. Only one was left until a silent rancher offered his name. The year was 1887, a time when the world was still raw and untamed. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the barren plains. The air was thick with dust, swirling in the breeze as men and women gathered for a grim event. This was no celebration. It was a market of despair. The auction was set up on the outskirts of a small town, the wooden platform stacked high with crates and barrels. A smell of sweat, leather, and horses filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of earth and dried grass. The Arapaho tribe, once proud and free, had been driven from their lands, their way of life shattered. Their people, once warriors and hunters, had been broken by years of conflict and betrayal. They were scattered across the land, their spirits crushed by the weight of the government's promises that never came. The men were dead or enslaved, the children left orphaned, and the women, like cattle, were sold to the highest bidder. Among the people gathered in the crowd stood a girl. Her name was Tala. Right. She had seen the loss of everything she held dear. Her family, once proud members of the Arapaho, had been torn apart. Her father, a strong man who fought in the tribal wars, had been killed when the soldiers came to their village. Her mother, with tears in her eyes, had tried to protect her, but there was little anyone could do. The soldiers had come in waves, taking everything they wanted, leaving nothing but broken lives in their wake. Now Tala stood at the center of a market where her worth was measured by the bids of strangers. Her face was still young, but her eyes held the weight of someone who had lived through far too much. She stood tall, her hands bound in front of her, but there was a strength in her posture. The fire inside her had not been extinguished. She could see the men around her eyeing her with hunger in their gaze. But there was something else too, a kind of sympathy that made her sick. They weren't bidding for her as a person. They were bidding for her as if she were some kind of prize, like a horse or a piece of land. The auctioneer's voice rang out, booming through the air, announcing each girl as they were paraded forward like livestock. The crowd watched with eagerness, their faces a mixture of greed and indifference. One by one, the other Arapaho girls were sold. Some were bought by ranchers who needed labor for their farms, others by men who wanted wives, and still others by businessmen who saw them as mere objects to be traded. Tala felt sick with every bid, every offer, every word the auctioneer spoke. The last girl had been sold, and only Tala was left. She stood there, alone and exposed, surrounded by men who had seen her as nothing more than a commodity. Her heart beat faster, her chest tightening with every passing moment. She wanted to scream, to run, but there was nowhere to go. Free. She had no family left, no home to return to. All she had was herself, and even that felt like it was slipping through her fingers. Past, his gaze falling on her, she locked eyes with him. The silent understanding passed between them, but Tala did not lower her gaze. Break. She would not let them break her. She had seen too much, lost too much to let them take away her dignity. But what was she supposed to do? She had nothing left to give, nothing left to fight with. Her pride was all she had, and it felt as fragile as the wind that howled across the empty plains. The auctioneer cleared his throat, and the bidding started. "Who'll give me $50? He called out, his voice sharp, cutting through the air. $50 for this fine, young woman. A strong, healthy girl, well-suited for a hard day's work. A man in the crowd raised his hand, his voice ringing out. 55! He called, his voice filled with eagerness. His hand shook slightly, but his eyes were cold, calculating. The auctioneer smiled, moving his gavel toward the man who had raised his hand. 60! Another voice rang out, and Tala felt her heart sink. This was how it would be. A bidding war. One after another, the men around her raised their hands, each offering a higher price, and each bid seemed to strip her of more of her humanity. She was not a person to them. She was a number, a price, a transaction. Tala's thoughts were a whirlwind as she tried to push the horror from her mind. She focused on the ground beneath her feet, the dry earth, the cracks in the soil, the faint rustling of the wind as it pushed the dust around her. It was all she could do to keep from crumbling. A tall man with a thick, dark beard raised his hand. He had been quiet until now, but when he spoke, his voice was deep and commanding. "Bray." 75, he called out, his eyes locking on her face. Tala couldn't tell if he was angry or if he was simply trying to play the game. Breath. He was different from the others. His gaze was steady, not filled with greed, but something more complex, something she couldn't name. The bidding went on, each man raising his price, each one bidding higher than the last, but none of them seemed to care who they were bidding against. It was as though they were bidding against each other for sport, not for the life of a girl who had already lost. Everything! But Tala wasn't just a girl. She wasn't just an object. She was a soul. She was a daughter of the earth. She was a survivor. And though her spirit had been shattered, it had not been broken. It still burned within her, hidden deep beneath the surface, and the fire that had kept her alive all these years refused to let her be reduced to nothing more than a price tag. The auctioneer's voice broke into her thoughts again. 85! Who'll give me 85? He asked, his voice full of excitement. Tala didn't know how long the bidding lasted, but it felt like hours. She tried to keep her focus, to keep her heart from breaking under the weight of it all, but it was hard. Every word that was spoken, every number that was bid, felt like a hammer hitting her heart. She wanted to fight, but there was nothing left to fight with. Narration. She was already defeated, already lost. And then it happened. As the auctioneer called out for a final bid, a figure in the back of the crowd raised his hand. His presence was quiet, almost imperceptible, but his movement was swift and decisive. The man was different from the others. He didn't speak, but when he raised his hand, the bidding stopped. It was as though the world had paused in that one moment, and every eye turned to him. He stood silently, watching the proceedings, his face unreadable. The auctioneer looked at him, then back at the crowd, unsure of what to do. The man didn't seem to care about the bids. He didn't seem to care about anything but her. Tala's heart skipped a beat. The room was silent, all eyes on him. For the first time that day, it felt like someone was finally seeing her, not as an object, but as a person. Brash. The room fell silent after the man in the back of the crowd raised his hand. All eyes were on him. The auctioneer, a man whose voice had carried over the crowd with force just moments before, now seemed unsure. The buzz of the crowd died down, and the noise of the other bidders faded into the background. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy, as the man stood there, his expression unreadable. Tala stood motionless, her heart pounding in her chest. She had felt the gaze of every man in that crowd. But this man, this silent figure in the back, felt different. It wasn't like the others who had looked at her like an object, a possession to be claimed. This man wasn't interested in just buying her. There was something about the way he stood, the way he raised his hand without a word, that made her think he wasn't here to win a bidding war. He was here for something else. The auctioneer hesitated, his gavel raised in the air as he looked from the silent man to the rest of the crowd. He cleared his throat, his voice now softer. "I'll give it a moment," he announced. "Is there anyone who will raise the bid?" $100, maybe?" But no one else spoke. The crowd, usually so eager to make a deal, remained still. It was as though the man's presence had cast a spell over them. For a few moments, no one dared to challenge his quiet authority. Tala couldn't take her eyes off him. She couldn't understand why he had raised his hand. What did it mean? Was he just another man who had come to buy a girl for his own purposes? Or was there something more? She had seen many men in her life, all of them, in some way, taking what they wanted. But this man was different. She could feel it in the way he stood, calm, collected, but unyielding. The auctioneer's voice broke through her thoughts. "Sold," he said abruptly, slamming the gavel down. The words hit Tala like a wave. "Sold!" The room seemed to spin for a moment, and for the first time that day she felt a tiny flicker of something inside her. She didn't know if it was hope or fear, but it was something. The crowd slowly started to disperse, the energy shifting now that the bidding was over. Tala remained standing in the center of the platform, her hands still bound, her chest tight. She felt like she should move, like she should do something, anything, but she couldn't bring herself to take a single step. And then he moved. The man who had made the bid was walking toward her, his boots silent on the dusty ground. He was tall, but not overly so. His shoulders were broad and his face was serious. His dark eyes, however, were the most striking feature. They weren't cold or cruel like so many men's eyes had been that day. They held something else, something hard to define. It wasn't pity. It wasn't curiosity. It was something far deeper, something that spoke to the soul. Tala stood still as he approached her. Rasp. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. There was an air of quiet power about him that made it clear he wasn't here to play games. He was here for a reason. As he came closer, she could see the deep lines on his face, lines that told stories of hardship and loneliness. This man had lived a difficult life, and somehow, despite everything he had been through, he still stood strong. Breath. When he reached her, he finally spoke, but his voice was low, almost as if he were speaking to himself rather than to her. "Are you all right?" His question was simple, but there was something in his tone that made it clear he wasn't asking out of politeness. Breaths. He wanted to know. He was trying to understand, not just to fulfill some duty. Tala didn't answer right away. She couldn't. There were so many things she wanted to say, but the words got stuck in her throat. She wanted to scream, to shout at him, to demand why he had bought her, what he expected of her. But instead, she found herself looking into his eyes, the same eyes that had watched the auction unfold in silence.
He looked at her, waiting for an answer.
But his gaze didn't make her feel pressured. It was steady, patient, as though he had all the time in the world. But breaths. Something about the way he held himself made her feel like she was more than just another object to be bought and sold. But she knew this man had already done something that no one else had. He had treated her like she was worth something more than just the sum of the bids placed on her. The moment stretched, the tension hanging in the air between them. Finally she spoke, her voice small, uncertain. I don't know." He nodded, as though that answer had satisfied him in some way, but he didn't press her further. Instead, he gently untied the rope that bound her hands, his fingers brushing her skin lightly. But Tala flinched at the touch. But the man didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he didn't react. His touch was steady, deliberate, as though he had done this many times before. When the rope was finally removed, he stepped back, giving her space. He didn't say anything else, just stood there, watching her. It was as though he was waiting for her to make the next move. Tala stood for a moment longer, unsure of what to do. She had been told to stand still, to wait, to be sold. And now that it was over, she didn't know where to go. She didn't know what came next. The man seemed to sense her hesitation. "Come with me," he said quietly. It wasn't an order, but a request, soft yet firm. "I have a place for you, a place where you can rest." Tala didn't know why, but she followed him. There was something about his words, something about the way he had said them, that made her trust him, at least for the moment. She had no choice but to trust him, didn't she? What else did she have left? They walked together in silence, the crowd behind them growing smaller as they moved further away from the auction. Allah glanced back one last time, but the faces in the crowd seemed distant now, like they belonged to another world. The man led her through the dusty streets of the town, his pace steady, not hurried. He didn't look back to see if she was following. She did, though. She followed without a word, unsure of what would happen next, but somehow she felt a small sense of calm settle over her.
It wasn't peace. Not exactly, but it was something. Something she hadn't felt in a long time.
And so they walked in silence, with nothing but the sound of their footsteps and the wind in the distance. The ranch was not far from the town, but the journey felt longer than it really was. Tala walked alongside the silent man, her feet dragging slightly as they made their way down the dusty path. The sun was beginning to set, casting a soft orange light across the land, and for the first time that day, Tala allowed herself to take in her surroundings. She wasn't sure why, but something about the quietness of the place felt different. It wasn't like the chaos of the auction, the loud voices of the men and the endless calls of the auctioneer. It was just calm. The soft rustle of the wind through the dry grass, the distant call of a bird, and the rhythmic sound of their footsteps. Tala could feel the weight of the day pressing on her shoulders. Breath. She had been sold. Her life, once her own, had been handed over to someone else, a stranger, Brace, a man she knew nothing about. Someone who had raised his hand without a word, without any hint of what he wanted. What did he want with her? Why had he chosen her? The question swirled in her mind, but she didn't ask them aloud. She couldn't bring herself to. They walked in silence, the distance between them filled with unspoken words. Tala had never been good at talking to strangers, especially men. The few men she had known in her life had always been cruel, controlling, and demanding. They had never treated her like she mattered, and yet this man, Elijah, she had heard someone call him, was different. Desperation. She could tell that much already, even if she didn't understand why he had chosen to buy her. She couldn't help but wonder what kind of life awaited her at this ranch, what kind of man he really was. The ranch came into view as they rounded a bend in the road. It was a sprawling piece of land, with a large wooden house at the center, surrounded by barns and corrals. There were horses grazing in the distance, and the faint sound of cows could be heard as they moved about. The land stretched far into the horizon, a place that seemed both peaceful and vast, like a world all its own. Tala couldn't help but stare at the ranch, taking in the scene before her. It was nothing like the small, worn-down cabin she had grown up in. Her home had been modest, simple, but there had always been warmth in it. Here, everything seemed so big, so open. She felt small, insignificant, like she didn't belong. Elijah, as though sensing her discomfort, turned to her.
"We're almost there," he said, his voice low and steady. "You can rest once we get inside."
There's no rush. Tala nodded, though she wasn't sure how to feel. She wasn't sure she would ever feel at ease here, not after everything that had happened. Still, there was something in his voice, something kind that made her believe he wasn't like the others. He wasn't asking for anything from her. Not yet. That was different. They reached the house, and Elijah led her inside. The door creaked as it opened, revealing a large open room with wooden floors and simple furniture. There was a fireplace at one end of the room and a long table in the center, surrounded by chairs. It was warm inside, the fire crackling in the hearth, and Tala felt a flicker of comfort. It wasn't much, but it was more than she had known in a long time. Elijah gestured to the table. "Sit," he said.
I'll get you something to eat. Tala hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do.
Ration. She had never been treated this way before. She was used to being told what to do, to being ordered around like a servant, but here it was different. Elijah was not demanding. Perhaps. He wasn't forcing her into anything. He simply gave her a choice. She sat at the table, her hands resting on her lap, feeling out of place. She didn't know what to say, how to act.
Should she thank him? Should she say something else?
But before she could decide, Elijah returned with a plate of food, a simple meal of bread, cheese, and some roasted meat. He set it down in front of her, then stepped back, waiting. He said, "Eat to regain your strength." Tala looked at the food, then back at him. There was something so genuine in his manner, so unassuming that for a moment she forgot to be wary. She hadn't realized just how hungry she was until she saw the food in front of her. It had been days since she had eaten properly, and the smell of the meat made her stomach growl. She picked up the bread and took a small bite. The warmth of the food filled her, and for the first time that day, she felt a small sense of comfort. The hunger in her stomach was still there, but it wasn't as urgent now. But she didn't have to rush. She could take her time. Elijah sat across from her, his eyes watching her, but not in a way that made her feel uncomfortable. He wasn't scrutinizing her every move. He simply seemed to be waiting, observing. Tala couldn't decide if that was better or worse. It was as if he were waiting for her to decide what came next, waiting for her to take the first step. She looked down at the food, her hands trembling slightly. "Why did you buy me?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. It was a question she had been wanting to ask ever since the auction, but she hadn't had the courage. Now, it just slipped out and she couldn't take it back. Elijah didn't answer right away. He just looked at her, as if weighing the question carefully. "I saw you," he said after a moment. "And I saw what was happening. I couldn't just stand by and watch." His voice was soft, but there was an edge to it, a quiet intensity. "I didn't buy you because I wanted anything from you. I bought you because I couldn't let them have you." Tala looked at him, confused. "Why?" she asked. "Why do you care?" "You don't even know me." Elijah sighed, the sound low and full of weariness. He ran a hand through his dark hair, his eyes distant for a moment, as if lost in thought. "Because I've been where you are,"
he said quietly.
"I've seen what it's like to be broken, to lose everything, and I couldn't let them take you. I know what it's like to feel like you have no choice, like you're just a thing to be traded, but you're not that." "You're not a thing!" Tala was silent for a long moment, taking in his words. Brit. She wasn't sure if she understood, but something in her stirred. She had been lost for so long, drifting from one place to the next, but here, for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of safety. Not just from him, but from the land itself. The silence, the openness, it felt different here. It felt like it could be a place to heal, a place to rebuild. She didn't know how she could trust him. She didn't know how she could trust anyone. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw something that gave her a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could start over.
Elijah stood up slowly, breaking the silence.
You can rest here. I'll give you time to settle in. No one will bother you. Tala nodded, the words sinking in. Verse. She wasn't sure if she could believe him completely, but for now, she would take it. She would take this small step. It wasn't much, but it was something. And that was enough. The days that followed were quiet, peaceful, in a way that Tala hadn't known for years. At first, she didn't know how to react. She was used to the chaos, the noise, the constant tension of survival. But here, on the ranch, there was none of that. The land stretched out before her, vast and endless, and the silence was different. It wasn't empty. It was filled with the soft sounds of the world around her. The wind in the trees, the call of birds overhead, the steady movements of the animals that lived on the land. Elijah showed her how to take care of the animals, how to tend to the land. He taught her how to milk cows and feed the horses, how to fix fences and mend the broken tools that were scattered across the yard. The work was hard, but it was simple. It didn't require thinking about things she couldn't control. It didn't ask her to remember the pain of her past, to remember the auction, the loss, the fear. For the first time in a long time, she could just focus on the task at hand, and that was enough. There were times in the early mornings before the sun had fully risen, when Tala would stand outside and watch the sky turn from dark to light, the first hints of dawn spreading across the horizon. The light would catch the edges of the hills in the distance, and the land would come alive. It was the same sky she had seen many times before, but here it felt different. Just here. She could breathe. She could look at the world and not feel so small, so lost. Elijah never pushed her to talk. He never asked her about her past, about what had happened to her. He just let her work, let her find her own pace, and little by little she began to feel like she could breathe again. There were moments when she would catch herself smiling, moments when she would forget what had happened, and for those fleeting seconds she would feel like a person again, not just someone who had been bought and sold. Brand. Afternoon as they worked together in the fields. Elijah glanced over at her. Breath. You're doing well, he said quietly, his voice steady, but there was a hint of something in it that made Tala pause.
She wiped the sweat from her brow and gave a small smile.
Thank you, she replied. Her voice was soft, and she wasn't sure why she said it, but it felt right.
It's hard work, but it feels good. Elijah nodded. It's the kind of work that gives you something to hold on to.
You don't have to worry about anything but the day in front of you. Tala thought about his words for a moment. I never thought of it that way. I'm used to just surviving, you know. She turned to him, a bit embarrassed by the admission, but something in her urged her to say it. I'm used to just doing whatever I had to do to get by, but here, it's different. I'm not just trying to get through the day. Elijah looked at her, his eyes steady. No one should have to live like that, he said softly. No one should have to just survive. His words hit her harder than she expected. It was as if he understood something deep inside her, something she had never shared with anyone. She didn't know how he knew, but for the first time it didn't feel like a burden. Rest. It felt like a relief. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. She could live here, on this land, with the work, with the quiet, with the peace, breath. As the days passed, Tala's confidence grew. She was becoming part of the ranch. She started to notice the small changes, how her body was growing stronger from the work, how her mind was starting to settle, no longer constantly searching for a way to escape. She even began to enjoy the silence, the stillness of the land. It was different from the noise of the auction, from the violence she had known before. It wasn't the same kind of freedom, but it was freedom, nonetheless. Yes, there was a rhythm to the ranch, a steady, unhurried pace that felt natural. The mornings were spent with the animals, feeding them and making sure they had everything they needed. The afternoons were spent repairing tools, fixing fences, and preparing the fields for planting. Breeze. In the evenings, there was always work to be done. Cleaning up, mending the broken parts of the house, or simply sitting together in the quiet of the night. Elijah was always there, his presence calm and steady. Breath. He never asked for anything more than what was needed. He wasn't the kind of man who demanded attention or praise. He was just there, working beside her. And it was in the simple things, the way he fixed the fence without needing help, the way he took care of the horses, the way he shared his meals with her, that she began to trust him. They didn't talk much, but there were moments when their silence felt comfortable, like they didn't need words to understand each other. They didn't need to say anything at all. It was in the small things, the way he would hand her a tool without speaking, or how he would look up at the sky with her as the stars came out, both of them lost in the vastness of the world around them. One evening, after they had finished eating, Elijah sat by the fire, his hands resting in his lap. Tala joined him, sitting quietly beside him. The fire crackled between them, casting a warm glow on their faces.
"You've been here for a while now," Elijah said, his voice breaking the silence.
"How are you feeling?" Tala thought for a moment. She hadn't really thought about it.
Breaths. She had been so focused on the work, on the day-to-day tasks, that she hadn't taken the time to consider how she felt. But now, with the fire flickering in front of her, she realized how much had changed. "I'm better," she said quietly. I'm not sure how to explain it, but I feel safer. I feel like I'm actually living, not just trying to survive."
Elijah nodded, as if he understood exactly what she meant.
He didn't press her for more. He just sat there beside her, watching the fire, as though he too was content with the quiet. It was in that moment that Tala realized how much she had changed. The girl who had been sold at auction, the girl who had been lost and broken, was no longer the person she was. She had become someone new, someone who could breathe, who could find peace in the quiet, who could learn how to live again. She wasn't sure where this path would lead her, but for the first time in a long time she felt like she had a future.
Elijah stood up, dusting off his hands. "It's getting late."
"You should get some rest," he said, his voice still calm but with a quiet authority. Tala nodded. She wasn't sure what the future would hold, but for now, this was enough. She had found something here, something she never thought she would find. It wasn't just a place. It was a new chance, a chance to rebuild, to start over. And as she turned toward the small cabin that would be her home, she realized that she wasn't just living on a ranch. She was living again. She stayed on the ranch long after people stopped talking about the auction. At first, no one in town believed she would last. They expected her to run, to cause trouble, or to disappear the way so many others had. But seasons passed, and she remained. Life did not suddenly become easy. The ranch was quiet, often lonely, and far from anything familiar. The land stretched wide, open, and unforgiving. Winters were harsh. Summers were dry and endless, yet the girl learned the rhythm of the place. She woke with the sun and rested. When the light faded, she fed animals, carried water, and walked the fence lines. Each task gave shape to her days. The rancher never treated her like property. Breath. He never raised his voice. He never demanded gratitude. At first, they spoke very little. When he did speak, his words were plain and careful. Bah! He showed her where food was kept, where she could sleep, and which parts of the land were hers to walk freely. That freedom mattered more than anything else. At night, she remembered the auction. Not in sharp images, but in feelings. The heat, the noise, the waiting. She remembered standing alone after the others were gone. She remembered how invisible she felt. Those memories did not leave her, but over time they lost some of their weight. The ranch gave her space to breathe, and silence became something safe instead of frightening.
As years passed, the girl grew into a young woman. Her hands became strong.
Her steps became confident. She learned how to care for horses and how to read the sky for signs of coming storms. The rancher taught her these things without lectures. He showed her once, sometimes twice, and then trusted her to learn the rest on her own. People from town came by less and less. When they did, they noticed changes. The girl stood straighter. She met their eyes. Breath. She spoke when she chose to, not when she was forced. Some did not like this. Others were unsure what to make of her. But no one questioned her place there. The papers were clear. The rancher's name stood beside hers in the records. That name had power in a world ruled by ink and signatures. Still, the name was never used to erase who she was. He did not force her to forget her language or her past. When she spoke of her people, he listened. When she sang quietly while working, he did not ask her to stop. He understood that survival did not mean forgetting. It meant carrying memory without letting it destroy you. One spring, officials came to update land records. They asked routine questions and checked dates. One man paused when he reached her name. He frowned, tapping the paper with his finger. She was part of that auction, he said. No, the rancher replied calmly. She was not sold. The man looked confused.
The records say. They say she came here under my guardianship, the rancher interrupted. That is all. There was nothing more to argue.
The law, imperfect as it was, stood on his side. The man nodded and moved on. The woman watched the exchange quietly. She understood then that what saved her was not kindness alone, but restraint. He had worked within the system without becoming part of its cruelty. As time went on, she began helping others when she could. Travelers sometimes arrived hungry or injured. The ranch became a place where people could rest for a night without being judged. She shared food, water, and silence. She did not ask many questions. She knew what it felt like to need help without explanation. She also began teaching the rancher words from her language. At first, he struggled. His accent was rough, his memory slow, but he kept trying. Each word spoken was a small bridge between two lives shaped by very different losses.
They laughed sometimes, soft brief moments that never lingered too long. Years later, when the rancher grew older and weaker, she took on more responsibility.
She managed the land, the animals, and the dealings with town officials. They respected her now, even if they did not fully understand her. She carried herself with quiet confidence, shaped by hardship but not broken by it. When the rancher passed away, there was no grand funeral. Just a few people, a simple marker, and the land he had protected.
In his will, he left the ranch to her.
Breath. No explanations. No conditions. Just trust. The town took note. Praise. Some were surprised, others were not. By then, her presence was no longer questioned. She had earned her place through years of steady work and quiet strength. Desk. She kept the ranch running. She hired workers fairly. Breaths. She treated people with respect, no matter where they came from. She became known as someone who did not talk much but always kept her word. Sometimes, at dusk, she walked to the edge of the land and looked toward the horizon. She thought of the girls from the auction, their faces, their fear, their unknown futures. She carried them with her, not as wounds, but as reminders.
History would never tell the full story. Records would list names, dates, and transactions.
They would say she was transferred, not sold. They would never mention the silence that stopped the auction, or the choice that changed one life without demanding ownership in return. But she remembered. And because she remembered, the story did not end on that platform. It lived on in the land she walked, the choices she made, and the freedom she protected, both for herself and for anyone who came after her. Developer mode ChatGPT can make mistake,